Hey, how's it? I'm Dan. Welcome back to Breathing Underwater's Moviecast. And yeah, I am well aware of how much background noise there is. Right now, I'm just starting out on like a 4 to 5 hour drive to the beach. But look, here's the thing about having 3 kids, full-time job, pets, house, all the luxuries and responsibilities of middle classness, is it means I can only get to stuff when I have the time. Do I ever have the time for stuff, especially sitting down and concentrating and making stuff? No, not really. So I have to find the time when it presents itself and take advantage of it. So I'm in the car, AC's on, because it's excruciatingly hot out. Got my paddleboard on the top of the car that's probably going to make a lot of vibrating noise. But like I said, I'm going to forge ahead. I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity of time where I would have spent the whole trip thinking about. Now I can just process it verbally. So come along on this verbal vomit ride with us. Now with quality control out of the way, let's get into this episode's topic. As usual, I am way late to the game because of all the stuff I just talked about with time and responsibility, but better late than never. So a couple episodes ago on this podcast, I talked with my friend Jason about what I dubbed the Ouroboros franchises, the ones that are eating themselves alive because they seemingly have nothing new or creative or interesting to bring to the table. They're just cannibalizing themselves. 2 of those franchises were Star Wars and Star Trek. And if you listen to that episode, you heard me mention a little history with these franchises, but I'll reiterate that here. Just for some context, my dad is a huge sci-fi nerd, and there was no hierarchy of one over the other. There was no Star Wars versus Star Trek. There was only Star Wars and Star Trek are great in my house. My dad grew up with the OG Captain Kirk show, which we did watch a good amount of in my house, but I was a Next Generation kid through and through because that's what was airing when I was a kid. And they were putting out all the toys. So as I was watching TNG and then Deep Space Nine and a little bit of Voyager, I was also asking for Starship Enterprise, D, and the Deep Space Nine toys, ships, and figures for Christmas, for birthdays. On the Star Wars toy front, I remember I had all sorts of different iterations of the toys over the years. But the first one, I'm pretty sure my parents got the original, like, minifigures that they put out, or in between A New Hope and Empire. I'm pretty sure it might have been after Jedi because there were Ewoks as part of it too. But either way, it was those older ones from the 80s that were smaller, and they came in like a big case. And I think my parents found them at a Goodwill, like fully intact. And of course, we were kids, so we played with them, broke them, lost them, and I only have a few left. And you can see on my Instagram the remnants of that collection that I still have, along with the fact that, if memory serves correctly, pretty sure that either the first or an early date of my parents was seeing A New Hope before it was episode 4, possibly on opening night. I'll have to double check on that. And then we had the theatrical cut, because this was before the extended editions were put out, on VHS in the late 80s, early 90s. Of course, Empire is my favorite now, but as a kid, I think Jedi was the one that I watched on repeat the most because it was the fluffiest and the pacing was the most kid-friendly, I think. But yeah, I held both of those franchises up to the same beloved level. It wasn't until later in the early internet when I started to get clued into the fact that there was a rift between the two. But for me, if I'm looking for some good, solid science fiction with a little bit of action, interesting, well-rounded characters that embody a lot of pertinent and timeless philosophical and topical thematic content, there was nowhere better to look than Star Trek. Really, in any of its iterations before they started making Next Generation movies. And I think one of the earliest movies that I remember seeing was Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, with my dad and his equally Star Trek nerd friend, Uncle Nick. And a few years later, I remember getting in trouble at school. It was like my first detention in 3rd grade because we would do journal sharing time after we'd have some quiet journal time. Somebody would volunteer to share their journal entry, and a kid in my class shared that he saw Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, that weekend, which I had also with my dad. So as an inside joke, my feedback to him when I was called on for journal feedback was Spock's quote at the end when they're being told that it's time to be decommissioned. Spock says, "If I were human, I believe my response would be, go to hell, if I were human." So I say that out loud, thinking that everybody would get the joke, because why wouldn't they? And of course I got in trouble for saying hell. I had to stay after school. I was very upset, because I was a good kid. I never got in trouble. So thanks a lot, Star Trek. Star Wars I saw in theaters when they were hyping up the release of Phantom Menace. I remember they put the extended editions in theaters, and we saw all those as a family. And having grown up with the theatrical cuts, I wasn't impressed with the editions, but I was young. I was a 13, 14-year-old. So when Phantom Menace first came out, I wasn't as a discerning connoisseur of film that I am now. And I remember vaguely enjoying it, but not being super impressed. And then I was in early college when Attack of the Clones came out. And of course, I was studying film at the time, so that's when my film spidey sense was really triggered, and I realized what a train wreck the prequels were. I only saw Revenge of the Sith because of the hype that it was so much better than the other two. Even like my indie darling Kevin Smith at the time, I remember this is pre-Clerks 2 Kevin Smith, came out and said that Revenge of the Sith was just as good as the OG trilogy or something like that. And I felt the same about it as the other ones. Just because it was darker doesn't mean that it was better or didn't have all the same problems that all the prequels did. And even with Disney and the sequel trilogy and The Last Jedi and my current feelings about the Star Wars franchise, the revisionist history about the prequels just blows my mind. I've said it before, and I'll say it again on this Star Wars themed podcast. The prequels are pure and utter trash, from script to execution, just because they have good ideas buried underneath all of the trash doesn't make them good movies, good stories, good films. So in that regard, for my youth going into my adulthood, if I wanted, as opposed to Star Trek with more grounded and heady sci-fi, if I wanted epic space adventure fantasy, because I agree with Red Letter Media's assessment on one of their prequel reviews where they differentiate between science fiction and science fantasy, Star Wars is definitely not as much science fiction as it is fantasy. But Star Wars was a franchise that I would go to if I wanted something at that scale and in that genre. But regardless, if I just wanted space-based entertainment, I would go to either franchise. But because Star Trek was kind of treading water with the Next Generation sequels, I remember Insurrection coming out when I was in late high school and I didn't see it. It wasn't really in the forefront of my attention at the time. But unlike some things, I never really dropped off or rejected either. There just wasn't a lot of major output in the early 2000s, so I wasn't really focused on them. But still, because of the prequels, Star Wars was definitely taking that drop first, while Star Trek was always just kind of there and fine and beloved, like I said. So fast forward to 2009, prequels were several years in the review mirror, and a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, up-and-coming director, J.J. Abrams, was rebooting Star Trek. And I gotta say, when I first saw that movie, and on rewatch, it is a lot of fun. It definitely feels more like Star Wars, and that's why, speaking of Red Letter Media again, when they predicted or suggested that JJ would be a great Star Wars resurrector because of his work on Star Trek, and JJ said as much himself, that he was not a Trekkie, he was more of a Star Wars guy. Still, it kind of brought both of those worlds together for me. It was great seeing the characters and the ships and the iconography, but with the pacing and more of the visual flair of a Star Wars movie. It did, at the time, seem to breathe a little life back into Star Trek, especially after it really just kind of went out with a whimper with Nemesis. But then we entered into the 2010s, and the writing on the wall was really there with Star Trek Into Darkness. I remember walking out of the theater, and I think I tweeted or Facebooked at the time that I was really happy that there was finally a referential Star Trek movie that wasn't insulting to the fans or something like that. I don't know why I thought that at the time, because the whole Khan thing, as soon as I really sat down and thought about it, was the stupidest writing choice ever. And obviously that wasn't the first time that we entered into this age of nostalgia and member berries over actual good storytelling and characters and characterization. But it was definitely not as pervasive as it is now, 10 years-ish later. And then I almost forgot to mention it because it was so forgettable, but Star Trek Beyond I only watched because people were saying, as usual, it's a return to form and it's, the best and closest thing to old Star Trek that we've had in modern days. And I just thought it was so generic and boring and tired. There was just nothing interesting about it or memorable. So then it was really no big surprise that JJ moved on to Star Wars and brought that same kinetic energy and asinine humor to The Force Awakens. Yet, I was still cautiously optimistic, especially after the disappointment for me of the prequels, that maybe Disney could breathe new life into Star Wars. Give it something that George Lucas had lost sight of. And like a lot of people, at first, I was pleasantly surprised by how solid The Force Awakens was. I didn't think it was amazing. I didn't think it was the second coming of Star Wars, but it definitely felt like things were back on track. And I think that was kind of universally agreed upon, even if people didn't like Force Awakens as much. We had to agree that at least there was some energy back into the franchise. So I was actually really excited to go see The Last Jedi. I had seen Rian Johnson's Brick when I was in college, and honestly I don't even remember it very well. I just had the girl from Lost, which was huge at the time, so I was really excited about that, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who's always great. But I remember thinking the movie was pretty decent. I saw it in an indie theater when I was going to film school in Philadelphia. So I was like, indie director is going to take on Star Wars. Maybe that'll be interesting, take it in an interesting direction. And I remember walking out of the theater so bewildered by The Last Jedi because I loved and hated it at the same time. It had so much good stuff and so much utter garbage. I was like, what did I just watch? And then, of course, the conversation exploded around that, and it completely divided the fan base and the critics and everything. And then on the other side, you had Paramount and CBS All Access launch Star Trek Discovery, and eventually Lower Decks and Picard. And with everything going on and all these acquisitions and all these reboots and just, the 2010s, when it came to big franchise nostalgia diarrhea, I was still, because of my foundations laid with these franchises, hopeful that something good could come out of this, even if it wasn't by any of the original creators or writers, producers, that new blood could maybe come with new visions and something interesting to say through these platforms that had started out as timeless classics. But no, the homogenization of Hollywood, which my brother Dave and I talked about much earlier on this podcast, got its hooks in every major franchise and minor franchise. So by that point, I didn't even make an effort to get CBS All Access. I heard how dark and nihilistic and cynical Discovery and Picard were. Didn't have any interest in giving my time or energy or money to that kind of output from Star Trek. And then after Last Jedi, I really was done with Star Wars, though everybody was raving about Mandalorian, or at least saying, kind of like they said about The Force Awakens, that it was a return to form. It wasn't amazing or perfect, but it was the best Star Wars that we've had since the OG trilogy, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I thought the first season of Mandalorian was very enjoyable. It had a nice edge that we haven't seen a lot in Star Wars, with how relentless, focused, and gray area moral that Din Djarin or the Mandalorian was at the beginning. But by the time we got to season 2 of that, and it got more and more nostalgia bacon wrapped, and then of course with Boba Fett being the absolute mess that it was, Obi-Wan, Dear Lord, and I understand that those were meant originally to be spin-off movies like Solo, and even though Last Jedi kind of ruined my hope for any good new Star Wars content, I did really enjoy Rogue One for what it was. It was just fun. It felt Star Warsy to me. It was just like a fun space war movie. It felt big in scale and scope, and it was epic. And I gotta say, Solo was probably like the most entertaining Star Wars thing that I've seen, surprisingly, for decades. Like, with the exception of some huge flaws, some character inclusions, annoying droids, and some just dumb nostalgia plot stuff like how he got his name and blaster and jacket. I thought the movie was really good, as Star Wars goes. But again, soon after, the Disney Plus stuff was just such a mess, and I know that the side character spin-off shows were originally conceptualized as movies a la Solo, and then they decided to retool them for Disney Plus. I mean, come on, like, you're talking about 6 episodes. You couldn't come up with a better story or plot than what they gave us. It really seemed like the whole point of Kenobi, or Obi-Wan, or whatever they call it, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the only thing that they really had planned out for that originally was the showdown at the end, which was, I don't think, very well executed for screen, but it did fill in that plot hole that Lucas himself wrote in to his own movies, where Alec Guinness tells Luke that, you know, essentially Darth Vader and Anakin are 2 different people, and Anakin was hunted down and betrayed and all that stuff. That was a really cool moment. I don't do straight up reviews, so if you're here and you are really worried about not being spoiled on something that happens on one of these shows, go watch the show. And then come back and listen. But I just wanted to give my overall thoughts and reactions, especially because of everything I just said about how I really didn't think I was going to be watching any output from either of these franchises anytime soon. So I'm going to start with the one that I have less to say about, and not because it wasn't impactful or I didn't enjoy it or was entertained by it, but I think it would just be kind of boring and redundant to listen to me say, oh, this was good, oh, and that was good, and they did good with this, and this was good. But Picard Season 3 was really good. as I think was the general echo around the internet as it was being released, Star Trek fans alike were like, oh, look, it's Star Trek. Because it really did feel like a gathering of old friends. I don't mean old as a pun, but honestly, I think it was a really big, bit of a bold swing to say we're going to unify the whole main TNG cast with some other side characters from that era, and for the most part have them be the main protagonists of the show, because that's really not what Hollywood seems to like to do these days. And I get it, you know, if an actor and a character is past their prime, the directive is, see what I did there? Like we've seen so many times now, is to deconstruct and belittle and tear down the older characters, the seasoned characters, the legacy characters, to supplant them with new, plucky, modernized, often obnoxious, younger characters, which I understand on a franchise business marketing level. They're trying to connect with a younger audience. It only makes sense to be bringing in new audience members to old franchises, so it's not just an aging audience that is into it. But if you're going to do that, you got to make it good. You have to make those new characters worth replacing the old characters with, or passing the torch to, or whatever. And more often than not, it seems like they're in such a rush to just keep the brand alive that they don't develop these characters very well, and look no further than the Star Wars sequels. But we'll get into that later. I'm supposed to be focused on Star Trek right now, so we'll stick with that. Again, I haven't watched any new Star Trek output since Nemesis, other than the J.J. Abrams reboots, which weren't really adding anything new to the table. Again, they were just kind of keeping the brand alive. But from what I heard about the first 2 seasons of Picard, it sounds like they were doing just that. They were figuratively and literally tearing apart Jean-Luc's legacy to insert all these new blood characters that just sounded like the worst. And I can't judge it because I haven't seen it, but I've seen enough YouTube dissections and discussions and breakdowns to have a pretty good idea about what I'm not missing. So I thought it was risky and awesome for a showrunner, a young showrunner it seems, to step in and say, no, we're going to actually give Star Trek fans what they want, which is revisiting these legacy characters, but showing growth and evolution from the time that we've seen them to now, and making them the focal point and the center point of the show, that the plot and the conflict revolves around them, that they're not just like supporting characters or window dressing for some other crap going on that they're just like along the ride for. So I'm sure they knew that wasn't going to bring in a lot of new audience. It was more going to speak to like my generation and older, but it seemed like they were more focused on telling a good story, and the show was just better off for it. Surprise, surprise. But for the most part, the characters seemed very intact. Obviously, the biggest flaw was the show being tied into the other couple seasons of Picard, where they did a lot of bizarre and asinine things via the plot to the characters, like making Picard a synthetic but still gonna age and die normally. And the more modernized dialogue and quips and the swearing, which was just never part of the Star Trek mythology. I mean, it was quite the opposite. Obviously, like Star Trek 4 was a big example of that. Double dumbass on you. You gotta talk like them, Spock, you see. Those unevolved, unenlightened, 20th century Neanderthals. Oh, and Data's like umpteenth resurrection or something. That kind of stuff definitely held the show back from being amazing, but I don't know if that's what Star Trek needed anyway, was, some new groundbreaking. I don't know if any of these franchises are ever going to have that again. But I think this is exactly what Star Trek needed, was something to show that the heart and soul of Gene Roddenberry's vision is still alive, and there are still stories to be told based on what he started and his successors expanded upon in his universe with Next Generation. So for instance, the plot was pretty simple. It was I don't want to say predictable, because I didn't see the big Borg twist coming necessarily, but I did feel that it was derivative of a lot of things, like the vision, who am I really kind of stuff with Jack was just, I felt like I've seen that a million times before. And it's fine, you can do similar things. There's only so many stories that can be told in so many ways. So as long as it was leading to something interesting, which it was, that was all fine. But as it was unraveling, I thought like the red door and everything was just a little kind of hokey, reminding me of like House on Haunted Hill, which did it a lot better. But again, it all was forgiven by the end because the plot actually led to something. And I think I heard an interview, if I remember correctly, the showrunner said that they had originally envisioned it as a film, or that it was supposed to feel like a long film, like they keep saying about these Disney Plus shows and stuff, which they don't, because they're so weirdly disjointed and all over the place in terms of tone and plot and pacing and characterization. But this definitely felt consistent, and it built on itself. It didn't spin its wheels very much, and I love the homages more so than just the straight up references, like the cat and mouse game in the nebula with the shapeshifters. That was very reminiscent of Wrath of Khan kind of stuff. That stuff, there were so many times where I turned to my wife, who was graciously watching this with me, having not seen, I don't think, any Star Trek since The Next Generation aired. I would turn to her and say, that is so Star Trek. That is so Star Trek. There were so many great little moments, especially when the bridge crew was back on the Titan and then the Enterprise, and they were dealing with engineering problems and like Moriarty. There were so many great like callbacks and things that weren't just, like, hey, remember this? And that leads to the whole Borg thing, which at first I was like, oh, of course they're going to do the Borg. Didn't they, as far as I know, they already did stuff with the Borg in the last season of Picard. So I was like, oh, the Borg again, really? But once I realized that it wasn't just a status quo, hey, it's another Borg adventure, but they were actually doing something interesting with it, kind of like when they brought in Hugh in The Next Generation. That was a change of status quo. I think that might have been one of my biggest gripes about First Contact, which I actually watched more recently, just kind of randomly. I was like, oh, I haven't seen this in a while, and I don't think I can bring myself to watch Generations anytime soon. Because as much as I enjoyed that, seeing it in the theater on opening day as a kid, the way they handled everything, but especially Kirk's death, was just such a letdown. But First Contact, even though it, invoking Red Letter Media again, it definitely has its flaws. It's a fun, solid movie, and I just love spending time with that cast in any way I can get them, except modern Paramount Plus way. Picard Season 3 notwithstanding, of course. But to have a film that is in the same plot continuum as TNG, and to have the Borg be the big bad, they didn't really do much with that. They just kind of had a little side adventure in the past, putting things right, and then going back to status quo. So it was really cool that even though they were going back to the same well that they've been back to many times with the Borg, they took it somewhere new. And I was totally fine with that. I thought it was really interesting how, after all these decades, and however long the Borg have been around, that they finally expanded the Borg lore, not to be confused with Data's brother lore, by having this sort of like biological nanotech that can be passed from generation to generation. That is so Star Trek, and that is so Borg, that they would do something like that. Not everything would be just cybernetic implants like they've been doing for the whole time that we've known them. So that was kind of like a retcon, but it was a really fitting one, I think. But going back to the characters, I thought they did a really good job of saying, okay, who are these people now based on who they had been and where they were going the last time we saw them? It made so much sense for Geordi to be where he was and preserving his legacy. And I mean, even though it is kind of eyebrow raising at this point that they would rebuild ships the way they do in Starfleet, like after Kirk blew up the Enterprise and then there's like, hey, here's a new Enterprise. But still, it made a lot of sense for Geordi to do that. It made a lot of sense for Crusher, having been a lifelong physician, to do a sort of like intergalactic Doctor Without Borders thing. The Worf stuff was a little cheesy, but I mean, he was sort of a breakaway from his people and culture, more, evolved Klingon, if you will. So I guess seeing him more in a Zen place would make sense, especially as an older man. But they did play it for laughs more than taking it seriously, so that was a little on the edge of like in-universe believability or verisimilitude, but I was fine with it, and I did get a lot of good laughs out of him, and he was still a badass. Like, it would have been one thing if he just stood back and let everybody else do the fighting for him, but he would say he's a pacifist and then step in and like stab people through the chest, decapitate them, so I was like, all right, I'll take it. But so them by themselves were great, but when they got back together, especially those last couple episodes where they were sitting down, discussing things, problem solving, and the fact that even though there is a hierarchy, there was never any kind of like, I don't know, dare I say wokeness to it, where just because somebody was an old man, that their opinion was like considered outdated or invalid. Even if it was flawed or short-sighted, there was still value in what everybody brought to the table and their own experience and perspectives. And that was one of the great things about old Star Trek, was how they worked as a team and a crew. Even when they went AWOL and were under threat of being court-martialed, they were always working together. They would rally with each other and trust each other. And it's that kind of camaraderie. Instead of, from what I understand about Discovery, for instance, and elements in Picard, where you'd have this crew in a futuristic, military-like organization, and yet they were like very narcissistic and childlike, petulant, mean to each other, name-calling, quippy, untrustworthy, unreliable. They go off on their own, not apologize for it. All that kind of stuff. You wouldn't see that in classic Trek, and Picard Season 3 understood that, respected it. But the thing about the characters that worked the best for me was the heartfelt moments. They really took care and respect with setting up and evolving relationships that could pay off in really great, heartfelt moments that felt true when they were paid off. For instance, all the baggage between Picard and Crusher and Beverly and Jack, and how it seemed like there was a lot of dead ends that they would hit because of their baggage. When things finally came around full circle and they realized what they meant to each other, what they needed from each other, and how that played into the plot, that was so satisfying, because not only was it satisfying within the context of Star Trek, but it was just really good character work and really solid writing. Oh my god, the Data and Geordi stuff, I might have got a little choked up here and there. I don't know if there was anybody to corroborate that, but there was some good stuff there. Especially when Data was facing off with Lore in that ethereal plane that they were in together, and he picks up Spot. That was so sweet. Another thing about the characters, though, was I really appreciated how they were emotional creatures, but that wasn't seen as a detriment. Even the quippy, stoic, snarky, sarcastic captain, I think it was his name, Shaw, of the Titan, he was a great character because I hated him at first, and I think he was supposed to be kind of a unlikable but relatable character. But you hated seeing him being so mistrusting and sometimes cruel to his elders and superiors. You knew he had a point because they were screwing around with him. But when he had that like outburst with Picard and you realize why he was so angry, there was a lot of really relatable emotional stuff there, but it didn't take away from his character. It didn't make him feel like weak or childish. Everybody brought some kind of emotional baggage to the table, and yet it wasn't treated with cynicism, which we see a lot. Again, like I heard in Discovery, there was just a lot of like emotional outbursts that didn't really fit the scene or the context. It was just underwritten characters that needed dramatic moments, so they would just push the emotions up to 11 to try to wring some blood from that stone. But in season 3 of Picard, they really allowed there to be emotional stakes around the bigger plot that were set up and developed during the course of the show instead of just shoved into scenes arbitrarily. So yeah, all in all, Picard season 3 was a big win, not just because it was better than the subpar drivel that's come before it, but on its own, I think it stands alone as just a solid season of television, a great sci-fi adventure, and a great season of Star Trek. And when I ever get the time and energy to go back and revisit TNG and Deep Space Nine, maybe Voyager, I will definitely include season 3 of Picard as a closure to that run of material. And I'm willing to give, if they do a spin-off with Jack and Seven of Nine's adventures, I'm willing to give that a shot, especially if it's produced by the same team that made this. Now on the flip side, and I know I'm going to get flack for this, but I have to be honest, because that's what my content is all about, is about how I honestly feel about stuff and what I'm passionate about. And honestly, if I am not passionate about something, then you're not going to hear about it. Passionate doesn't always mean passionate in a positive way, though. Sometimes I can passionately despise some piece of content, but the worst is if it had no impact on me, if I nothinged it, if I was totally apathetic towards it. That stuff you probably won't be hearing about because I have nothing to say about other than, well, just go see my thoughts on Star Trek Beyond. Anyway, as passionately optimistic and positive as I was about Picard, I'd say I was on not the other end of the spectrum, but definitely dipping below zero on the positive to negative number line when it came to Andor, which is surprising, number one, because again, the hype around this show was immense. All my YouTubers and critics and other trusted sources from friends and family were telling me that I needed to watch this show because it was the best thing that Star Wars has put out since whatever everybody's last favorite thing of Star Wars was. A lot of people said Jedi, though. And again, I really enjoyed Rogue One. I didn't think it was like amazing. I wasn't really attached to any of the characters, and knowing that they were all going to die, it was kind of just like, you know, they served a purpose. Though, you know, there was some compelling stuff there. It just, you could tell that that poor movie was rewritten and reshot and re-edited to be something that it wasn't originally intended to be. I'll never forget seeing the trailer the first time and them showing, is it Jen Erso, whatever her name was, in an Imperial outfit, and hearing Forrest Whitaker's voice saying, like, if you go down that path or whatever, what will you become? And it was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, she's a non-force wielding rebel. Is she going to flirt with the dark side, though, or changing sides or something? And then they didn't do anything with that in the actual movie. So still, the movie I thought was fine. I need to watch it again to see if it holds up. But that was the only thing that really tipped me over the edge, though, because everybody was saying all the stuff about Mandalorian and everything, and I found the Mandalorian to be watchable, but not really like jump out of my seat for. But people were really going on about Andor. So just like Picard season 3, I decided to give Andor a chance, watch an episode or two, and I had heard that it was in like mini arc chunks, so like the first few episodes had a different sort of plot trajectory than the next few and so on. But I was just going to kind of see about the tone, the setups, the conflicts, the characterization, see if it was something that I was even interested in watching in general, let alone being a Star Wars product. And right off the bat, I can't say that I was hooked at any certain point. Honestly, if I hadn't invested any certain amount of time in it, and if I hadn't been watching it with my wife, who wanted to keep watching it too, I don't really think I would have shed a tear if I stopped watching it at any given point after the first episode, because I didn't find there to be any major hook of the show, unlike Picard, which I'm going to stop comparing the two at this point because they're very different in terms of the writing and the vision, the tone. There's not a lot to compare and contrast other than that they're both big franchise, space related. But Andor just came across from right off the bat as very detached to me. What I mean by that is, at very few points, if ever, in the show did I feel emotionally connected to or compelled or interested in or hooked by any given character, especially the main characters, which was frustrating because there was a lot of interesting stuff going on. There was a lot of plot, even though the pacing was very slow, and I know a lot of people criticize it or pointed that out. That was not my biggest issue at all. I have no problem with a slow burn plot as long as there's building tension and it's building to a conflict, that's compelling. So there was like the heist and the prison break and, the bubbling, burgeoning rebellion and everything. There was interesting stuff happening in this show, but I never felt that it was embodied by any of the characters in a way that made me, where I'm like, oh God, I can't wait to watch an episode because what's going to happen to this person? How is this person going to react to that? That kind of stuff. Because this plot is always going to happen, but if there aren't characters to like carry you through it emotionally, I know that works for some people. They're just really interested in the cause and effects of plot. I guess that's why people like Transformers movies and stuff, but for me, I need the emotional buy-in. I need the emotional stakes. How does a plot affect the characters, and why is that important to me as an audience member, as a viewer, as a consumer of these stories? Andor, I just always felt very much on the outside, like almost like I was watching, a docu-series or something. Like, oh, there goes this Imperial guy and this rebel person doing their thing. Oh no, they're gonna get caught, but I barely got to know them anyway, or they're gonna get fired or they're gonna get tortured. But I barely got to know them anyway. I don't get to know like who they are as people, why getting caught, killed, captured, tortured, imprisoned matters. And it wasn't just like the stoicism of the acting, though that really didn't do much for me either, where everybody was kind of characterized very similarly. I mean, obviously the most interesting dimensional character was Skarsgård guy. I forgot his name in the show, but he had to play a lot of roles. And it was interesting seeing him going from like flamboyant antiquity shop owner to gunning down TIE fighters that were after him and stuff. That was interesting. And his big emotional outburst when that like double agent Imperial guy asked him what he sacrificed for his cause, and he, you know, goes on about everything. That was interesting stuff. I did like that. I thought the writing was good, the acting was amazing, all that kind of stuff. And yet, for some reason, I just never felt pulled in and sucked into the story and the characters. Honestly, I think some of it is that the writing was not as smart or complex as it thought it was or presented itself to be. Maybe it's just me, but it had this air of pretension about it where it was intentionally trying to say, hey, I'm not your regular Star Wars. I'm not for kids. I'm adult. I am dark and broody and complex, you know, and the way that they structured scenes, even the way the things were edited sometimes, the way it was kind of confusing about like who was who, whose motivation was what in what certain scene and context. When I saw the whole thing and I looked back at it, I was like, that really wasn't as complex as I think it thinks it is. They were just trying to, you know, smuggle this thing, or they were trying to do something nefarious. And it didn't need to be that convoluted. I think it thought that its convolution was, they were mistaking that for complexity, and that happens a lot when it comes to plotting. But I do think that, at least the way that it came across, that the writers were a little bit too self-back-patty about, oh, isn't this going to be so interesting because it's so unlike what we're used to in Star Wars, as opposed to, isn't this interesting because I feel passionate about writing the conflict for these characters and how it's going to affect them as a writer. And on that front, I feel that there were just way too many characters, and not even characters that like had a lot to do or were very involved in the story, but every time we turned around there was some new, especially on the Imperial side, there was some new guy in a suit or uniform that looked vaguely like some other guy that we saw in another episode that never really got fleshed out or developed, and I was like, is that the guy? No, he's a different guy. And by the time it all came down to the climax with the rebel-ish riot on Andor's home planet, there were so many Imperial dudes that all looked the same, had the same air about them. I was like, I don't know who's who or why I should care about any of these fodder characters. And then the characters, especially on the Imperial side, I think the Imperial side of things was a big flaw for me. And it was very reminiscent of my feelings, the biggest issue that I had with the Defenders verse when Marvel was releasing their stuff on Netflix with like Jessica Jones and Daredevil, Luke Cage and everything. Spent way too much time with the villains, not even developing them as characters. Like all the stuff with Kingpin as a character I found really interesting, but every time that the villains were like conniving and scheming and bantering about who's gonna meet what seller on a dock and all that kind of stuff, it was like, who cares, you know, how their operations were run and all the minutia of that. It was like, I was like, why are we spending this time going over all this like extraneous plot elements that could be implied or just swept away with a line of dialogue or something, and wasting that time not developing these awesome characters. And that's how I felt about the Imperials too, for the most part in Andor, was not only were there too many characters introduced and not really done much with, but the ones that we focused on a lot, I didn't really see why they were given so much screen time, especially Mr. Dour, dejected, brooding security guy that gets ousted from his job before he's able to, see justice through to the end with Andor, and he goes on an obsessive mission to do so. There was so much time we spent with him just sitting with his mom in the kitchen while he was staring at his blue Cocoa Puffs, or the woman that he was obsessively stalking as she went through all this bureaucratic minutia with her superiors. I totally get what they were going for. I understand that the point was, look at the similarities between these huge, unwieldy organizations, how they can be so big and nebulous, but also full of individuals that can barely work together and accomplish anything. And I know they were trying to show the two sides of the coin, the rebellion and the empire. It's not about good and evil. It's about your perspective on what you think is right or just. And aside from the fact that, Star Wars didn't start out like that, it was a very line drawn in the sand of good versus evil, which is why I would call at least original Star Wars not just a science fantasy, but a science fantasy adventure or action adventure. The adventure side of it to me is that more traditional, classic, good versus evil kind of conflict, where you know who's in the right and who's in the wrong, and you want your heroes to succeed against their opposition, against the darkness, against the evils. Andor is like deconstructing all that, which is fine. It is what it is. But I felt like that point was driven home so much and given so much screen time that it got redundant and boring. Because after like the umpteenth, Imperial corporate meeting about how are they going to handle some new issue or track down some person or quell some uprising, I was like, just get on with it. Like, this is so uninteresting. And honestly, if I wanted to go watch like boardroom discussions about socio-political issues, I would watch Star Trek. However, Star Trek, most of the time, were written a lot more strongly and with a lot more solid thematic content and stakes around it. You would get introduced to this culture in Star Trek that would have this big rift somewhere in their culture, and it would be up to the crew of the Enterprise to try to solve it. And it would speak to how difficult, sometimes impossible, it is for these things to be solved. Whereas in Andor, it was more about, at least the way it came across to me, was like, yeah, isn't it lame how boring and corporate the Empire is? Well, look at the rebellion and how slapped together and unmanageable they are too. Ooh. It's like, what are you really trying to say? Like, what does it mean? I mean, yes, like, I agree that large corporations and bureaucracy can be the end of what we know as true humanity, but how many times do we need to make that point before we're just kind of spinning our wheels and wasting time that we could be developing these characters? Now, I know that Star Wars has been going this way for a long time, since the original trilogy. I know that Lucas himself started asking a lot of socio-political bureaucratic questions, starting with the prequels that I don't know who was asking for, like, oh, I wonder what would happen if there was a trade disagreement in the galaxy. But even so, it was never this sterile and, to me, unengaging. I think Andor has taken it to its extreme, because even though the prequels were sterile and boring in their own right, Lucas was still infusing some adventure into his science fantasy. Andor, even though it did have moments of extreme tension, I thought the prison break sequence especially was fantastic, but those were more exceptions to the rule than the show really being about that and upholding that tension the whole time and building on it. Well, let's get back to the characters a little bit more specifically. A big issue that I had with the writing and the editing, I guess, of the show was how a lot of the scenes lacked point of view focus. Even though I understood what the scenes were about and where they were going, a lot of times there were so many characters, like the heist sequence of episodes, the prison break to some extent, even though Andor and especially Andy Serkis killed it in that. I would have watched a whole show with Andy Serkis' story and how he got there and what happened to him after, unless he drowned because he couldn't swim, which is, I know what they were implying about a lot of people breaking out of that prison. But Andy Serkis was so good in that, and his character was so well written because he was layered and he had dimensions and he was doing what he thought he needed to do, regardless of if it was right or wrong, but he still had a sense of morality that played into his character arc. I mean, if you took his character and applied it to all the other characters in the show, I think the writers would have oh shoot, we forgot to have interesting developed dimensional characters like we did with Andy Serkis. Let's go back, guys, before we start shooting this. But no, it's like they put it all into his one character and they left it out with everybody else. So like in a lot of the other characters and the way that they were interacting in scenes, I wasn't really sure who I was supposed to be following, like who was in perspective in the scene, who was the scene about, who was it really affecting. A lot of times, like I said, it was just plot, like when they were going over the heist details ad nauseum, it was kind of everybody was there and everybody was reacting or not. And then you'd have these exchanges like with the kid and his journal and all of his philosophies. Were we supposed to be looking at that through his eyes and what mattered to him emotionally, or was it Andor that was being affected? We never really knew because they never gave us any, even like just basic reaction shots of stuff where somebody would be affected by something. Obviously, this wasn't always true because we did spend a lot of POV time through the eyes of the security guy and all of his moping around with his mom and at work and things. We spent some time with the girl in the chop shop from Andor's homeworld that was being tortured. But again, going back to what I said before, I didn't feel like any of these characters' journeys were laid out for us as an audience in a way that we were able to connect with them and their struggles. But the weirdest part about all of that to me was the fact that the show started with the foundation of having all of that character inner conflict that could play into external conflict and have emotional stakes and have a protagonist that this story was kind of told through, which was Andor. It started with Andor looking for his sister. Like, what more relatable thing could you start a show with than somebody having lost family looking for their family? And I thought they were going to do something with that, but it seemed like almost immediately they just used that as a plot excuse to have him off-world so he could get involved with a crime and get him on the Imperial's radar, kicking off, the rest of the plot that revolved around him. And then they had all those flashbacks with his sister. So then I thought, okay, fine, they're just going to let that go. And the only other time they mentioned that plot line specifically that I remember was when he was talking to his mother later in the show, and she tells him to stop looking for his sister. But I'm like, also, why? Because he hadn't been for most of the show after the beginning. He hadn't even brought it up. And everything that he was actively doing as a protagonist was not anything to do with his sister. He was either involving himself in his like black market trade and then trying to get off planet and escape, or he was more passively being shoved around by the plot, like getting in prison and then having to escape. So the only other stuff about the sister, though, that I thought it was going to come back around to something, I do understand that this is just season 1 of a larger story that they had planned out at least another season 2 that was supposed to lead up to Rogue One, if I understand correctly. However, I think it's safe to say that it's kind of like a screenwriting 101 thing by now, that if you're going to have a long-term story, and, you know, television is the worst with this, but we've seen it a lot more now in the past decade or so with Marvel doing its serialized movie universe and how other people have tried to jump on that bandwagon. But you can have hanging plot threads and yet to be fulfilled character arcs and payoffs and things, but you still have to have some kind of, to call something a season of television or even an episode of television, it has to have some kind of self-contained something. Otherwise, it's just, and this is what a lot of times Disney Plus has an issue with, it just feels like an arbitrary chunk of a larger story. And that's why I thought at least the flashbacks where we met Andor's sister and we got to see why their relationship was so important to him, why he would be looking for her, why they were separated in the first place, all that kind of stuff, it led to nothing. They basically just dropped those flashbacks after the first half of the show. And again, the plot with his sister was only brought up, I think, one more time, kind of offhand. So even if that was never meant to be paid off in the first season, in my opinion, there should have been more development of it to keep it relevant, not just to the plot, but to the audience. Because if they go back to that in the second season, I guarantee a lot of people are going to be, including me, are going to be like, oh yeah, didn't they mention something about that? Yeah, okay. And it's going to feel kind of arbitrary and just yanked out of thin air because they didn't keep it consistent. But it also speaks to a bigger problem, like I said before, is that they had the groundwork there to have Andor be a more interesting, active protagonist, and they didn't do anything with it. Then you had characters like Mon Mothma, who I thought were interesting from the get-go, but again, they just didn't really do much with them. There was a lot of implied tension, but the stakes were unclear, at least on a bigger level. I know that, if she had been found out, the Empire would have taken her, tortured her, everything. But again, I never felt super connected to her or her story empathetically to really care very much about what would happen if she did get found out. Honestly, the best setup and payoff in the show to me, or at least the best example of how they could have applied more conclusive writing in other areas of the show, was towards the climax when there was a kid on Andor's planet whose father was taken kind of unceremoniously, and his son was really upset, so he made like homemade bombs to combat the Empire, and he had a chance to use them during the riot scene. That was like a full circle setup and payoff. That also gave some insight into the character. There was a very resourceful, strong-willed kid that was willing to kill to protect his father and his people or avenge them. What an interesting grounds for a character that we barely got anything else for. Now, it probably goes without saying, but I don't have anything critical to say about the aesthetics, and the general production of the show was outstanding. It felt very cinematic. It would have been cool to see on a big screen just because it was so well filmed and edited. It had such a grand scale to it. I thought it did really fit the Rogue One aesthetics really well. They felt like they were in the same universe. And the acting was top notch, especially when the characters were allowed to act. I know that, like for Skarsgård, when he was underplaying or being subtle, he was an actor that was playing a character that was acting. So there were a lot of layers there. That was really interesting. But for other people like Andor, I never really kind of felt like he was fully there. And I don't know if that's the actor or the writing or the directing or all of it, but for the most part, the acting was great. I love seeing Mrs. Dursley in another role. I know she's a well-known British actor, but I haven't seen her in much since the Harry Potter movies, so I think the budget does show for the show. And they did a really good job with all the production aspects. It was just the writing and the undercookedness of, to me, the most important aspects of story, which are characters, emotional stakes, tension, payoffs, that kind of basic stuff. Andor was just lacking that stuff for me. I know that it spoke to a lot of people and it gave them something that they felt was really lacking from Star Wars, and I really respect other people's love of this show. I don't decry that at all. I can understand why people would like this kind of show. I think what it comes down to is that it just really wasn't for me. And the reason it wasn't for me is because I'm not really drawn to what the genre of this show really was. And this goes back to why I feel like, as well made as this show is, it's not really a good Star Wars show, because even though there's been a lot of different iterations of Star Wars content over the years, some better and some worse, overall, and I think even in the Disney Plus shows, they understood this to an extent, Star Wars is a science fantasy action adventure. That's what made it what it was at first. That's what gave it the feeling that people get from it. And then going along with that, it had really good, solid, interesting, charismatic, layered characters that we wanted to experience the story of this universe through. In a vacuum, if Andor wasn't connected to Star Wars, if it just was what it was, I don't think I would have liked it any more or any less, because it was more of a socio-political, big picture drama critique. I don't really think it's a satire by any means, but it's definitely, I think, more about its thematic content than its characters, and that's great. But that kind of material is just not what I gravitate towards. I gravitate towards good, solid, engaging characters in entertaining and fun situations. And that's not to say that I don't like a good drama or even a good slow-paced political thriller or something. But this was kind of that, but without the thrills. And that leads me back to a point that I've made before that I'm going to honestly and humbly eat my words about. Because when Disney bought Star Wars and the state of Star Wars where it was at that time, post-prequels but pre-sequels, I was one of those mouthpieces that was like, Star Wars is a universe. George Lucas created a open-ended universe that you could go any point in time, any planet, any environment, any setting, and you could tell any kind of genre story. And, you could still call it Star Wars because it's in the Star Wars universe. And I thought, and I bought the hype that the Skywalker saga was old and tired and needed to go away. So, like, when I heard that The Last Jedi was like, oh, the Jedi need to end, at the time I was like, yeah, the Jedi's been done to the ground. The X-Wings and TIE fighters and space battles and lightsabers, it's all been done and There's nothing more to do with that. That stuff's boring and redundant. We need news stories. So I was like, yeah, bring in political thrillers or espionage stories or comedies or horror. Like, do all of it. Bring it in, Star Wars. But now that I've seen Andor, I am completely changing my perspective on that. I think Star Wars is smaller. What makes it great is smaller than what I was giving it credit for. I mean, any story really kind of can open up its own fictional narrative universe that you could do anything with any characters in any time, any genre. But I guess this is the paradox question, is like, if you go off on those side tangents, does any of that really make it what it was intended to be? I don't know. But in this case, I just didn't feel excited. I didn't feel the adventure that I want to feel, and maybe that's my own entitlement. But I grew up, every time I think about Star Wars or I play with my Star Wars toys, that's what it was all about. It was about the fun and the adventure and the excitement. It never crossed my mind as a kid or even as an adult, like, man, I wonder what a Imperial boardroom scenario would look like. So even though I don't think that just throwing in a bunch more lightsabers and X-Wings and Star Destroyers, like they did apparently in Rise of Skywalker, which I refuse to watch, I don't think that's going to fix Star Wars either. But based on what I've heard about the viewership and the reception of Andor in a more wide sense, it doesn't sound like that's the solution either. I'm not saying that I have the solution of where Star Wars should go, but I do know what's not working. And though I'm really glad that they took a big swing with Andor and that Disney was willing to give it a big budget to make it feel big, I think the writers could have benefited from spending more time developing interesting, well-rounded characters instead of just relying on how interesting they thought that their vision was to tell such a seemingly deep and heady Star Wars story. All right, to wrap this long-winded rant up, I just want to say that I am glad that I watched both of these shows. As down as I was on Andor, I didn't hate it. Like I said, I wasn't indifferent to it because I did have a lot of things to say. And I may watch season 2 to see if any of the issues that I had were rectified. Though I'm definitely going to listen to the chatter before I do. But if anything, Andor gives me hope that at least Disney is willing to try different things. And hey, maybe they'll find their footing at some point. And then Picard gives me a lot of hope and just reinforces what I always say and what I will always continue to say, is that if you give the right people with the right passions the resources and ability to tell stories that they want to tell, that they need to tell because they're passionate about it and they have a vision for, then more likely than not you're going to get something quality, even if it's not for everybody. And Andor is quality. It just wasn't for me. So I'm not going to boldly go forward assuming that things are just going to get better from here on either of these franchises, but I do have a new hope that at least it's possible. I'm Dan. This is Breathing Underwater's Moviecast, and you can find me and yell at me about all the things I'm wrong about at breathingunderwater.us. I really appreciate you listening, and I will see you on the next one.